White exceptionalism birthed American exceptionalism, and that spawn child is now throwing tantrums across the globe, bombing countries, dismissing international laws, and evoking Western civilization as justification. Like any spoiled child who's never been disciplined, American exceptionalism believes it can take what it wants, when it wants, without consequence. Just look at January 2026. The US invaded Venezuela and kidnapped its president. And 1 month later, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, stands in Munich telling European leaders that the Western civilization gives them the right to dismiss international laws. And he gets a standing ovation. This is what happens when the father's violence goes unaddressed for centuries. The child inherits the entitlement, amplifies the cruelty, and weaponizes it globally. Reprimanding the tantrum child, American exceptionalism, unfortunately will not go away without calling out and annihilating its father, white exceptionalism. On February 22nd, 2026, just a few days ago, something happened at the BAFTA Awards that perfectly encapsulates the systemic problem that we're dealing with today. A man with Tourette's syndrome, John Davidson, involuntarily or voluntarily shouted a racial slur. I say involuntarily or voluntarily, as no one other than John Davidson knows if that is the truth. This was while Michael B. Jordan and Delroy Lindo, two Black actors, were presenting an award on stage. This was embarrassing, racial, and tragic. But here's what I need you to understand. This is not about John Davidson. It's not about Tourette's syndrome, nor is it about whether it was involuntary or voluntarily shouted out. This is about what happened afterwards. The BBC had a 2-hour tape delay before broadcasting the ceremony, 2 full hours to edit the show before it went to air. And they made a choice. They cut Free Palestine from filmmaker Akinola Davis Jr. acceptance speech. They edited that political statement right out, deemed it too controversial for broadcast, but they left the racial slur in, unedited, untouched, broadcasted to millions. When the backlash hit, the BBC issued one of those classic non-apologetic apologies. We apologize if you were offended. As if Black trauma is conditional, as if the weight, the pain carried by those words is a matter of opinion. Meanwhile, BAFTA didn't even speak directly to Michael B. Jordan and Delroy Lindo until public pressure forced them to. These men stood on that stage, heard that slur, maintained their composure and professionalism, and the institution that invited them couldn't be bothered to reach out privately before issuing a public statement. This is what I meant by institutional white exceptionalism. It's not about individual intent. It's about what the system chooses to protect and what it chooses to sacrifice. Political discomfort over Palestine, edited out immediately. Black dignity and trauma, let it ride, broadcast it, monetize it, then offer a conditional apology. This is the high-level problem that we're dealing with in 2026. And if you think that it's just about one award show, you haven't been paying attention for the last 500 years. Let me be very clear about what white exceptionalism is. It's the ideology invented in the 17th century that white people are inherently superior to all other races and therefore have the right to dominate, subjugate, and extract from non-white populations across the globe. This wasn't some fringe belief. This was the foundational logic that justified the transatlantic slave trade, the genocide of indigenous people, the colonization of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, the extraction of wealth, resources, and labor from the global south for centuries. And before you say, this again, shut your pie hole and listen. Here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. None of this has ever been formally addressed. No concession, no reparations, no apologies to the countries and the peoples who were plundered. Let that sit with you for a moment. The wealth of the Western world, the infrastructure, the universities, the museums, the financial systems was built on the backs of enslaved Africans and colonized people, and not a single nation that benefited has been held accountable. Britain abolished slavery in 1833. But you know who got reparations? The slaveholders. The British government paid them compensation for the loss of their property. And British taxpayers were still paying off that debt until 2015. The same descendants of slaves who went to England in the 50s and the 60s to rebuild England after the Second World War were in fact the same ones paying off the debt of the owners of their ancestors. Make that make sense. The enslaved people who built that wealth got nothing. The colonized nation whose resources were stolen got nothing. The indigenous peoples whose land was taken and whose population was decimated, nothing. This unaddressed violence is not ancient history. It's the foundation of the world that we live in right now. It's the father of what we are dealing with right now. After slavery was abolished in the United States, you know what replaced it? Sharecropping, convict leasing, Jim Crow, redlining. Black Americans were technically free, but the system made damn sure that they couldn't build economic power. I shouldn't have to go over what these are. That sharecropping trapped Black families in debt slavery and in a system of involuntary servitude. That convict leasing re-enslaved Black men through criminalization. Yes, Black men arrested for vagrancy. They leased them out to plantations and mines where they were worked to death. Jim Crow, lynching, redlining, Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Rosewood in Florida, Oscarville, which sits under Lake Lanier. And when the US government created programs that could build generational wealth for all Americans, Black people were systematically excluded. The GI Bill, the FHA loans, Social Security, all were designed with carve-outs that left Black Americans behind. This continued well into the 20th century. The result, today, the median white family has 10 times the wealth of the median Black family. That's not by accident. That's policy. That's the legacy of white exceptionalism operating domestically. But it didn't just operate domestically. While America was suppressing Black economic power at home, Western countries were doing the same globally. After World War II, as African, Asian, and Latin American nations gained independence from European colonizers, you know what happened? The colonial playbook just got updated. Enter the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. These institutions, controlled by Western powers, offered loans to newly independent nations, but the loans came with a condition: structural adjustment programs. Here's how it worked. A country needs development funds. The IMF says, sure, we'll lend you the money, but you have to privatize your public resources: water, electricity, healthcare. Open your markets to foreign corporations. Cut government spending on social program. Devalue your currency. Export your raw materials at rock bottom prices. The result? Debt traps. These countries could never repay the loans because the terms guarantee that they remain poor. Their resources flowed out to multinational corporations. Their people stayed impoverished, and Western banks collected interest payments forever. This is neocolonialism. Same extraction, same domination, just with paperwork instead of gunboats. Well, mostly paperwork. Because whenever a global South leader tried to resist, tried to nationalize their resources, tried to implement policies that actually benefited their people, the West always intervened. CIA-backed coups, assassinations, economic sanctions, military invasions. Iran 1953, Guatemala 1954, Congo 1961, Chile 1973, Nicaragua in the 80s, Iraq in the 2003s. The message was always clear. Your resources belong to us. Your sovereignty is conditional. And if you resist, we will destroy you. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. And it never stopped. Which brings us to 2026. On January 3rd, the United States invaded Venezuela, bombed Caracas, the first bombing of a South American capital, and kidnapped President Nicolas Maduro. Regardless of what you think about Maduro, let us be very clear about what happened. The United States invaded a sovereign nation and abducted its head of state. And Trump didn't even try to hide behind international laws or UN resolutions. He invoked the Donroe Doctrine, an 1823 policy, or should I say a 203-year-old policy that declared the Western Hemisphere's America's sphere of influence. Except now it's being called the Donroe Doctrine. He literally said American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. And just to make sure everyone understood, the State Department tweeted, "This is our hemisphere." Not a partnership, not corporation, ownership. This is the child of white exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is white exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is throwing a full-on tantrum in 2026. And if you think I'm exaggerating, let me take you to Munich, Germany, on February 14th, 2026. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stood before European leaders at the Munich Security Conference and delivered a speech that laid it all out. He said, "We are part of one civilization, Western civilization. We are bound to one another by the deepest bonds that nations could share, forged by centuries of shared history, Christian faith, culture, heritage, language, ancestry." Let me translate that for you. We are the superior civilization. We share blood, religion, and history, and we have the right to dominate everyone else. He went on to justify the Venezuela invasion and the Iran bombing by saying that the United Nations had no answers and that American leadership was required. Translation: international law doesn't apply to us. He stated migration was a threat to the survival of our civilization itself. He warned Europe about civilizational erasure if they don't control their borders. Translation: brown and black people are existential threats to whiteness. This is explicit white exceptionalism dressed up as foreign policy. And the most chilling part, he got a standing ovation. Because this isn't just America. This is the Western world reasserting the colonial playbook openly for the first time in decades. Now, here's what I need you to understand. When white exceptionalism is never addressed, when there are no reparations, no accountability, no structural changes, this is what we get. This is the system that we get. You get out free Palestine, but broadcast racial slurs, invade countries and call it restoring order, justify bombing civilians as protecting Western civilization, suppress economic development in the global South while calling it free market reform, criminalize and kill black and brown bodies while calling it law and order, and also the killing of their own and calling it domestic terrorism. This is not isolated dysfunction. This is the system working exactly as designed. Because white exceptionalism needs to maintain the hierarchy. It needs black people poor. It needs the global South dependent. It needs to be treated as a crisis. It needs to paint non-white population as threats. Because if it doesn't, the entire justification collapse. And American exceptionalism, the spawn child of white exceptionalism, is now in full-blown tantrum phase because the world is rejecting the hierarchy. Let me put it to you another way, because you're not getting it. White exceptionalism gave birth to American exceptionalism, and the world is now only reacting to American exceptionalism with hashtag don't buy American products and hashtag don't travel to the US. But what really needs to be addressed is hashtag knee off the necks of blacks, hashtag reparation for indigenous people, hashtag leave the global South alone, hashtag Africa for Africans. Now, did that make you cringe? Good, because if it did, you have some work to do. But first, China is building infrastructure in Africa and Latin America without the IMF debt traps. The BRIC nations are creating alternative financial system that bypass the US dollar. The global South countries are saying, we're done being your resource colonies. And the West, instead of adapting, instead of building genuine partnership, instead of acknowledging centuries of harm, it's doubling down, invading Venezuela, bombing Iran, threatening Greenland, bullying Canada, imposing tariffs, withdrawing from international agreements, reprimanding the tantrum child, American exceptionalism, unfortunately will not go away without calling out and annihilating its father, white exceptionalism. Now, do you get it? Do you understand This is a toddler throwing blocks when other kids don't want to play by its rules. If you are a Black person watching this in the West, you already know what I'm talking about. You live with the daily microaggressions, the macroaggressions of white exceptionalism. You navigate systems that assume you're guilty, that over-police your neighborhoods, that underfunds your schools, that denies you loans, that criminalize your children, that exhaust you from the constant need to prove your humanity. You watch your sons and daughters have the talk about how to survive police encounters. You see George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Trey Reed, Kyle Bisenga, and wonder if someone you love will be next. You watch the justice system fail you again and again. And you're tired of fighting a system that was designed to break you, tired of proving your worth to people who refuse to see it, tired of living in a country that uses your labor, your culture, your creativity, and gives you trauma in return. If you're Latino, Asian, Indigenous, Middle Eastern, or any other people of color in the West, you know this system too. You've seen your countries invaded, your communities demonized, your languages mocked, your religions vilified. You watch immigration policies that treat you like threats, economic policies that extract from your homeland, foreign policies that destabilize your region, and then criminalize you for fleeing the chaos that they created. You are caught between countries that don't want you and the system that was never built for you. And if you're a white person who sees this as a problem, who understand that white exceptionalism is destroying not just Black and brown lives, but the entire planet, you have to reckon with your proximity to power. You have to understand that silence is complicity, that benefiting from the system while condemning it privately is not enough. You have to be willing to risk comfort, to redistribute resources, to amplify marginalized voices, to challenge other white people, even when it's uncomfortable. Because white exceptionalism doesn't just harm people of color. It poisons everything. It creates a world where violence is normal, where exploitation is policy, where empathy is weakness. And unless you're willing to dismantle it, you're maintaining it. So here's where I land with all of this. If you are at a point where you do not wish to have these moments of institutionalized racism, these invasions justified by civilizational superiority, these daily indignities in your life, if you're tired of watching the same patterns play out, generation after generation, with no accountability, no reparation, no change, if you're exhausted by a system that was never designed to protect you, honor you, or see you as fully human, perhaps you too might have considered stepping away from both white exceptionalism and American exceptionalism. Not everyone can leave. I understand that. Geography doesn't erase trauma, and relocating doesn't solve systemic problems. But for some of us, there comes a point where we realize, I don't have to keep fighting this fight on this particular battlefield. There are places in this world where your humanity isn't questioned daily, where your children don't have to be taught to fear people who are supposed to protect them, where the weight of proving your worth doesn't crush you before you even start. There are places where you can build, create, rest, and exist without the constant hum of white exceptionalism in the background. I'm not saying that those places are perfect. Nowhere is. Racism exists globally. The colonial legacy is everywhere, but there are places where you're not the primary target, where the system wasn't specifically designed to break people who look like you. And sometimes that difference is enough. This monologue isn't about telling you what to do. It's about naming what's happening. It's about connecting the dots from the BAFTA editing room to the bombing of Caracas, to Marco Rubio's Western civilization speech, to the centuries of unaddressed colonial violence. If this resonated with you, sit with it, talk about it, share it. And if you're ready to explore what stepping away might look like, not as escape, but as a strategy, as self-preservation, as an act of choosing peace over perpetual battles, I'm here. My work at Relocate with Revenue exists because I believe that we deserve to design lives where we're not constantly defending our right to exist. You can find my information in the description below. not as a sales pitch, but as an invitation to imagine differently. Because white exceptionalism and American exceptionalism will continue their tantrums. The question is, do you have to be there when they do? I'm Emerald. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to be notified of any new videos. Also, share this video if it resonated with you. Choose peace, choose strategy, and choose to remove yourself from the exceptionalism, father and child. Peace out.